Let's start the first panel. My name is Kirill Petkov. I'm part of MoveBG. I'm very proud to moderate this panel. Bulgaria is not just a country, it's part of Europe. So European perspectives are also Bulgarian perspectives. So when we talk about the future of Europe, it's not an external factor, it's our future. That's why we need to be very well informed, aware of what's happening in Europe, because it's happening here too. And when we're making choices, like the one we're going to make on the 25th of May, we need to have in mind the main aspects of Europe. These are our main aspects. And I'd like to introduce our guests. I'm very happy to have them here. Marin Lesensky from European Policies Initiative, and he'll be talking about the catch-up index, whether European countries are coming closer to each other or not, years after they started their economic and political development. Evgenia Angel, who is the economic advisor to the President of the Republic of Bulgaria, who for many years has been working on competition of Bulgaria, but in the context of Europe. Yasin Georgiev is the CEO of the Economic Policy Institute, and he'll be talking about Europe in austerity or Europe with social policy. And Vladimir Shikarov, who will address very popular topic, but not very clear. This is the banking union and the positive and negative things about it. I'd like first to turn the floor to Marin Lesensky, who will talk about the catch-up index, and he will tell us whether Bulgaria and the other EU member states are coming closer to each other or not. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank MoveBG for the invitation, for organizing this conference, and for providing me the opportunity to present the most recent report of the Open Society Institute, which is about the catch-up index. First, a few words about what is the catch-up index. When we started developing it, the initial idea came from the question, where are we and are we there yet? If we watched Shrek 2, when Shrek was riding the donkey to the Magic Kingdom, he kept asking this question in the carriage, are we there yet? Are we there yet? So this is our aim, to keep asking the question, are we there yet? So, in order to see whether we are there already, we had to create this catch-up index to measure the progress of the EU member states, especially the new member states, following four criteria: economy, democracy, governance, and quality of life. And finally, we will make an overall assessment. So we have four main categories, 47 indicators, 35 countries were included in the index, all member states and candidate countries. So in order to measure cohesion processes, and that's why we needed those indicators, to measure those cohesion processes. So when we started thinking about the index, This was back in 2009, 10, and the main question for us was not whether, but when Bulgaria will join Schengen and the Eurozone. You know what happened, what has happened since then. Now we are having a second index. The economic crisis affected the European Union then, in 2009. And when you look at the effects of the economic crisis, plus the political crisis and the geopolitical challenges that we believed we had left behind at that time. So we have had indexes for 3 years, and we can compare, we can outline some trends of development. I'll start with the conclusions first, the other way around. So the main conclusion we can draw from this year's catch-up index is that catching up works. It brings about results. That is the lagging, those member states that are lagging behind, the new member states, they're catching up with the old member states, but not enough. The other thing I'll be talking about is the division lines and the cohesion models in Europe, the alternative perspective on Europe, several speeds Europe, and how this division is seen through the results of the index and the clusters in Europe. So I'll start with the clusters or the groups that we can see in Europe. Simply put, when we got the results from the index, we have 47 indicators, as I said. And each indicator has some score. So those countries with the highest number of scores are ranked better than the others. So we analyzed the results in the index, and we wanted to rank the groups, actually to group member states and European countries. And this is what we came up with. Which you can see on the slide. Those clusters actually group several countries that have similar characteristics, and at the same time you can see some clusters are closer to some than to others. And the next step we made was to map those clusters on Europe's map. And this is what we got. This is a very interesting result. I'll explain what you can see. These are the results from the assessments, the scores that the countries got, analyzed through cluster analysis. And we got 6 main groups in the European Union. And in the dark blue, you have the most advanced countries, highest score, and then moderate blue, you have not so advanced countries, and lower you go in yellow and orange and red. These are the most problematic countries. They have a low level of cohesion with the European Union, and this is the overall assessment of the catch-up index. And as you can see, there is a division in the European Union. the other important thing is that the old division between East and West, new member states, old member states, it's now being shifted to North and South. The old divisions are there, but now we have new divisions as well. In the most remote from the ideal, these are the countries in Southeastern Europe. The next thing we did, the same cluster analysis applied to the 4 categories: quality of life, democracy, governance, and economy. And these are clusters for the quality of life. You can see it's a similar division. And again, there is some division between East and West, like old member states and new member states. At the same time, there's a division between North and South. And what you can see, what's typical of the quality of life in particular, is that the 3 clusters, the most advanced countries, first, second, and third, these are different shades of blue, they are dominating, which means that most of the European Union lives in very good or decent, they have very good or decent quality of life. And the exception are the countries from Southeastern Europe. And there is some exception. This is Greece. I don't know whether you can see it on the slide. And this is a paradox, because in the other categories, Greece is part of the Balkan group, the less developed countries. But apparently, despite the crisis, it's been able to maintain its quality of life. The next cluster, the next result for the cluster analysis we got, this is this about governance. As you can see, the highest score belongs to the countries in Northern and Western Europe, and there's a division between North and South, which is more diagonal than vertical. And you can clearly see this.
Което също може да се каже отново е, че има явно разделение между страните,
is that there is a division between countries in the European Union and countries which are not members of the European Union. The candidate countries have lower scores. And briefly about economy. As you can see, the countries in the northwestern part of Europe are most developed. They have the highest score. Typical country, which is Luxembourg, with very high GDP. Also, the heart of Europe, German, France, Great Britain, they always appear in the new cluster. Maybe they're not the most developed ones, but they are the core of Europe, the heart of Europe. And you can see here, judging by the colors, you can see the effects of the crisis. Many of the countries were affected by the countries, and they are demoted to lower clusters. And the last cluster, this is the Balkans without Croatia. These are the democracy clusters.
подобно разделение.
You can see a similar division, and I'd like to focus on this in particular.
Един път това, което ни казват кластерите,
The
всъщност, че Европа е
clusters show
разделена
us
на
that
няколко
Europe
групи.
is divided into several groups of countries that are very different.
Както Георги Стойчев спомена в началото, една от основните проблеми
One of the main issues of the European Union is the lack of homogeneity in the European Union. And we believe that this is not only about political differences, but actually there are underlying problems, other problems. And the other thing that we can see on the map is that if we map all of those together, we'll see that the groups, the clusters are more or less the same. That is, we don't see much difference. There are some groups that develop and advance in the northwest. There's a group in the southeastern part that just doesn't go anywhere. In Bulgaria is part of this group, and this is very concerning. And the other thing that we can see that the other new member states, they blend with the old member states, and what we saw is that none of the new member states, the so-called new member states, the young member states, they haven't reached the average, the so-called average levels of development of the European Union, as we call it. But nevertheless, they are coming close. The Baltic states, Central Europe, they are developing very well, and they're approaching the old member states.
So this was one of the vantage points. It's a static vantage point. This is a snapshot of the current state of affairs in Europe. There is another thing. This year's annual report gives us the possibility to draw comparison and to call the trends between 2011 to 2013. Of course, I need to say that we're using data from preceding years, so we're following up on European development over a period of time. Next, I'd like to say that the drawings you will see will actually be tables which are a ranking. Do not take them as ranking of countries per se. Rather, interpret this as the big picture which you would be looking at from a distance. So what we have here is a lot of color, as I've warned you. These color codes provide more specifics about what has actually happened within the European Union over the past few years. Those in green are countries which are developing. Those in red are countries which are backtracking. And those in yellow are at a standstill. The dark blue ones are the old member states in the west. Then we have the new member states plus Croatia, and at the bottom we have the candidate states plus Iceland. So, as you can see, the new member states, by and large, have a lot of green, which means that over the years they have developed and they have progressed. Obviously, the process of cohesion is working with a few notable exceptions. Bulgaria and Romania do have some yellow and red spots, which means that they are at a stalemate or they're backtracking. So these are the fluctuations in the ranking. The most dynamic countries of the new member states are the Czech Republic. They have the highest results, so they are frog leaping by 4 positions during the 3 years in which we have ranked the countries. So, with the exception of Bulgaria and Romania, all the new member states are moving up. Now, let's look at the economics aspects. Again, those in red are countries which are losing traction. In the light blue, we have the countries which actually have been color-coded in green, which that means they are progressing based on the indicators we're monitoring. We have 3 countries which are lagging behind, and these are Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia. Now, on the issue of democracy, we have a patchwork. What we can say is that there are very few changes or alterations in the indicators. Obviously, this is a category where change is hard to come by. Quality of life. Once again, we have a mixed picture. The Czech Republic, Lithuania, and Poland are moving ahead. The quality of life is improving. Public services are improving. At the same time, we have countries which are lagging behind. These are the countries in red. Governance. As you can see here, by and large, there have been some improvements in Lithuania and the Czech Republic. The other countries are at a standstill. What does this drawing tell us? This is a summation of the weighted average. In the blue, we have the old member states. These are the 10 countries. In the red, we have the new member states plus Croatia, and in green, we see Bulgaria. This is the weighted average. The new member states as a cluster, when it comes to catch up in the economy, is faring a lot better, but the quality of life is lagging behind. Improvements there are slowest to come. So I will now focus on a few details in order to be able to garner the usefulness of this index, the catch-up index. We have different indicators: economy, education. What is the correlation there? This is just to show you how you can apply the index. So there is a clear correlation between the economic development of a country and the quality of education. For instance, there are countries which are highly developed, such as Finland and Estonia and Poland, and their educational results are so much higher than in the economy, which means that they have pretty good chances of developing further. Educational freedom. This is a correlation which we discovered a few years ago. So the higher is the quality of education in a country, there is a lot more media freedom. So it's another issue, what is the causal relationship? And now very briefly I would like to demonstrate another use of the catch-up index. What I have shown you so far is a static presentation. It's our interpretation of the index. What you currently see is an interactive website where all the data has been uploaded, and there are different applications which allow you to play with it. So, for instance, if you push the index tab, you will see all the data, and then you can use the various applications to do your own rankings, to do your own weighting of the different indicators, and create your own catch-up index and draw your own conclusions. And with this, I'd like to thank you. Thank you very much. This was a very interesting presentation. And from purely economic theory, I must say that what we see as conclusions is justified, it's attributable, there is convergence, countries are drawing closer, given their fundamentals. And as we have seen in Bulgaria, the fundamentals are the same, and we're converging. Western Europe has different fundamentals, and they're converging based on their own fundamentals. So it's important for us to monitor not just the end result, but also to monitor the fundamentals, such as innovations, institutional building. So if we can play with the institutions or improve the quality of innovations, then the convergence points would be enhanced. So let's move on to our second panelist, Evgeny Angelov, who will tell us whether Europe has the competitive edge, how does it compare with other large economies, and what can be done in order to enhance the competitiveness of Europe. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. I am still trying to figure out what was said about this correlation between education and innovation. This is mandatory for competitiveness. And by saying this, I think I've exhausted 90% of my presentation. But let me share some of my commiserations with you and some of the analysis which I've carried out on the competitiveness of Europe. This is a topic which is of great interest to the European Commission and the member states, particularly in the face of the crisis we've lived through. Now, speaking of competitiveness, we're talking about comparisons. And if we take European competitiveness and assume that on the one hand we have the United States as a competitor, and on the other hand we have China as a key competitor, within that context we have to decide where Europe actually is. So there are good news, there is bad news. As usual, I start with the good news after the depression that we saw that Bulgaria is experiencing. So, Europe continues to be the biggest and the richest market. 500 million consumers, the wealthiest consumers, the highest purchasing powers, and this is a competitive edge. But despite all the dynamics in world trade in the past 10 years, Europe continues to be stable and to be in the lead. I would like to share a few facts with you here. By and large, the European Union and its 28 member states in 2011 had a positive balance of 50 billion euro. In the States, we have a deficit of $475 billion, of which 92 billion are the positive balance in trade between the U.S. and Europe. China has 260 billion positive balance from exports, and compared to Europe, Europe has a deficit of 150 billion vis-a-vis China. It comes as no surprise that the only country who is a net exporter to China is Germany. But there are some positive conclusions to be drawn from these facts for the countries in Europe. Many of the components of finished products in China are actually supplied by the European Union. So, if we have 100 units of export, 60 of those units in Chinese products actually have come from the European Union. And this is a far smaller percentage for Japan and the United States. Likewise, Europe continues to be a leader in high-tech. I think that 2/3 of all production companies keep Europe in the lead. Europe is the key exporter, but there is a lot of disparity across Europe in that. And we can see which are the countries which are the main contributors for that positive balance. But by and large, the picture is quite hopeful. And there is another piece of good news. The European economy is quite diversified. If we take Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, each of the countries has different competitive advantages. Some have more advantages than others, but by and large, the economies are varied. I could not find any other good news. We have a long list of dramatic occurrences, and one of the major problems is that up until a few years ago, Europe was catching up with the United States when it comes to productivity, and we were catching up with most of our competitors, but that is a trend which has been reversed. The key reasons are the following. They were already mentioned. On the one hand, we have hyper-regulation. The way of life, the economies, society, everything is structured in a different way. So markets are over-regulated compared to the States, for instance. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, we have few investments in research and development, and this is a cause for concern. Scientific institutions, academia in general, are producing knowledge, innovations, but very few of them are transferred over to the industry, so they're not investing. The industries are not investing in research and development, and they have no idea how to do it in order to enhance their competitiveness, because the companies which are competitiveness has to do with corporations, not with states as such. So Europe is lagging behind the United States, it's lagging behind the large economies in Asia. And lately we have also registered fewer patents. In high-tech industries, Europe is no longer the key player. This is valid for computers, optics, optical equipment. We're lagging behind. And there is more drama to come, which we've discussed frequently, and this is access to finance, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. This is an issue everywhere. It's hard to overcome. But in Europe, much of state aid in any form is actually funneled into the large corporations. And we have considered this at length. This is an issue that's very difficult to resolve, Bulgaria included. But for instance, in the United States, they have found a solution which allows them to somehow tackle this drama. And there is something else that is happening. The so-called new economies, such as China and Korea, are entering, penetrating sectors where the EU and the United States were the leaders. At the same time, they have taken over mid-level technology sectors. So Europe has lost its foothold, and high-tech segments are shrinking. That is, high-tech segments in which Europe is the leader. And a lot has been written lately about Apple and Samsung. They cannot prove who invented what. And that is a curiosity. 10 to 15 years ago, that would have been unimaginable as a dispute. And I've already mentioned science and research. In Europe, we have a very powerful academic baseline. A lot of patents are produced, but a lot of those inventions and patents are being used in the States and China. So what needs to happen? That is the underlying question which has been asked frequently, and it's a topical issue because we're planning our budgets for the next 6 to 7 years, and we need to overhaul our vision of Europe. For countries such as Bulgaria and some other countries as well, it is obvious that we need to have a closer linkage of the markets. We need to have more Europe on the market. We heard a lot of statements to that effect. So there are those who want the European Union to disintegrate, to revert to national currencies. Economically speaking, to me, that is equivalent to suicide. And one of the main components is the unification of institutions, the coherence of regulations. Now, seeing where we stand in the big picture, this is far more important for us than it is for the Netherlands, Denmark, France, or Germany, because we have proven to the world in the past 20 years that we do not have the capacity, the capability to create strong institutions and regulatory bodies to regulate the private sector, thereby ensuring competition on the market. This is a key factor for our economy. If we take a look at all the purely Bulgarian companies who are operational, how many of them are competitive on the European and the world markets? Very few. Yesterday, there was a meeting at the Sofia University, and the competitive companies were few and far between, and they're only competitive on the local market. And there is something else to do with competitiveness, and the States and Europe are doing something about it. A lot of importance is assigned to low-tech and high-tech sectors, in particular in segments which use products which are based on knowledge, which are knowledge-based. So these are the sectors which provide a lot of job opportunities within the EU. So if we're losing our positions, this means that we're creating a lot of structural unemployment which will not be resolved only through investment in high-tech. There is another major topic having to do with doing business in the EU, bankruptcies, how they are perceived, creating funds, venture funds. There is a huge cultural problem in Europe which has a very difficult solution. The stigma that is attached to failing is very difficult to overcome. I've been looking at rankings, how easy it is to start up a company. And statistics there are irrelevant. Whether it takes you a day or 5 days to start a company, if you've decided to do it, you'll do it. But it is important to know how much time you will need in order to wind up a company that has failed. At the Ministry of Economy, there are probably, maybe not hundreds, but tens of companies which de facto have gone bankrupt. But because of the administrative burden, they have not officially been stricken off the registers. So the business environment and everything attached to it and doing business is one of the key issues on which Europe needs to move ahead. So by and large, that's everything I needed to share with you. Thank you. And just another piece of good news having to do what Evgeny has done and the startup funds which have been set up in Bulgaria. At this point in time, these are sources of change, and if we look at the innovative venture funds which have been launched in Bulgaria, this gives us some hope because they're drawing in not only Bulgarian ventures, but they're drawing in many startup companies from the Balkans and even the EU. So there's always hope, there's always something to do, as long as you can put your heart in it and you really want to do it, and that's why we're all here. So let us move on to the next topic and to Yasen Georgiev, who will dwell on a very important topic. This is social Europe or austerity Europe. So where's the future? How do we get there? First of all, I'd like to thank MoveBG for inviting me here. I thank everyone who's here because they show an interest in this topic, and it's a very timely conference, and we need to speak about the pros and cons and the challenges that Europe is facing and that we have to face because of the European Union. There are lots of opportunities, but there are also a lot of limitations which affect our economy. We may be left with the impression that we're far more dynamic, that is, the private sector is far more dynamic than old Europe, but if we look at the catch-up index, it seems we're chasing our tails, and we're just running around setting up companies, venture funds, but the big picture shows us that we're a country which is lagging behind. We're right at the bottom of the list and on economic indicators. So have we done something wrong with our fiscal austerity? Have we gone wrong with all these constraints that we introduced? Because there are countries who did not introduce austerity measures, but their quality of life is far better. So now is the time to talk about the Europe we want and the kind of Bulgaria we want. There are several vantage points to take into account. Purely statistically speaking, the revenue part of the budget as a percent of the GDP shows us that the state has intervened in redistribution, but far less than in Central Europe. In Central Europe, and if we take the average for Europe, we have far less interference. That is, less than 40% of GDP has been redistributed. So one might say we have a model whereby the state has reneged on its participation in education, health, the economy even, and at the same time there are countries where the state has exceeded the 40%, but they're living a lot better. So we cannot overlook the fact that there have been many additional factors affecting our standing. in the big picture, but there has been a lot more expenditure for more social prosperity, or do less spending in order to ensure stability and economic growth. If we take the big picture, we can say that there is a lot of gray. In 2011, actually until a year ago, academia kept quoting the Harvard professor Rolf and Reinhardt, who kept saying, and they were taken to be the Bible for financial stability, and they were saying that economic growth is slower in countries where there is over 90% redistribution. The European Commission, Olli Rehn, everybody else signed on to that, and that was wind in the sails of German politicians, and they believe that austerity is a recipe for success both in old Europe and those who are playing catch-up in the periphery of the European Union. As it turns out, though, there was some research carried out by a student at the Massachusetts Technology Institute, and they found that there is a warp in the correlation between austerity and growth. It seems that austerity can provide growth in the long term, but there are others who argue that the state should participate in economic development because this theory is failing. So the pendulum swung to the other extremity, and it said austerity backfire, so let us spend. So neither of these two positions are completely true. They may be true for a period of time, but they are not applicable in every case. So, Europe of austerity Europe, or Europe of solidarity, with the ability of the state to intervene more frequently, is a big issue which can be interpreted many ways. If the state intervenes more, if the EU intervenes more in budget redistribution, we could take another case in point. If we take someone who has a dependency, if we give him a large dose of the substance he's addicted to, would that cure him? Would that resolve his problem? So if we're talking about austerity in Europe, we can say yes, that works, but if we have excessive spendings, such is the case in Southern Europe, where there is less financial or fiscal discipline, that means that there will not be long-term investment in education and healthcare. So whatever we say, unless the state intervenes, there will be no other mechanism to rely on in order to balance the system of inclusive growth. We could also draw the issue how Europe is faring. In 2010 and 2011, it was found that the periphery of the EU is losing traction, and then the Commission adopted a document whereby it was possible for these countries to use bailout money, such as Greece, Ireland, and Portugal. And these are the countries which use that mechanism, whereas Romania and Hungary were supported beyond Europe in order to reduce co-financing. So if you overlook the national budgets, in order to start up the economy, the EU would fund projects in these countries of up to 95%, and they would just provide 5% of co-financing. Many countries within the EU, Bulgaria in particular, country with a good fiscal policy interpreted this as a case where the dunces were being supported and those who had all the A grades were actually punished. So, the increase in co-financing would mean that there will be less money for more projects, but if countries such as Bulgaria are not successful in uptaking EU funding, this means that there will be less participation and the big picture would look better. What else is there to say? I believe that in the course of the debate we will hear a lot of divergent opinions and we'll have an interesting debate. In 1980, the social costs of the EU were 15%, up to 17%. Today, they are 25%. So the social costs are growing despite austerity. And the last topic now, we're moving from the more general to the more specific to wind up, and we're going to talk about the banking union in the EU as a mechanism which has the potential to protect Europe from crises such as the one which we've experienced. Can that really work? For the response, I'll give the floor to Mr. Sirkarov.
Thank you. I will first start by thanking MoveBG for the invitation and for organizing this venue with this topic. Unfortunately, the Bulgarian political elite does not discuss those topics at all because of lack of competence, maybe. But we were going to discuss this issue in the second panel. We'll be able to do this in the second panel. We have very competent panelists. But regarding the banking union, I first have to make a distinction between the European Union and the Eurozone. I support the single market and the free movement of labor and capital, and also goods and services, free market for goods and services. But I'm very skeptic about the Eurozone, the underlying idea and the way it's structured. We know that the establishment of the Eurozone went through a very difficult period in 1999-2000. Many people were very skeptic that this could become a reality, that Germany would give up the Deutsche Mark. But this happened, and this happened with the support of France and the support of socialists from Germany. It's a political project, and it has very serious structural problems. I mean, the idea about a centralized currency system instead of the system of the individual central banks, the currency nationalism, so to say, which actually focuses on the currency wars that we witnessed. But both systems, we should say, it's like choosing between the systems, like choosing the lesser evil. And in my brief introduction, I can say that the centralized work of the European Central Bank presents a moral risk, a hazard. The ship that is sailing can face things like a country having a serious deficit spending, and at the same time when we run into a difficulty, this country may not pay the price that it has to pay, like the price that Bulgaria paid in the 1996, 97 for all those crazy things that happened here. So in a union like this, we can see Greece, it technically bankrupted several times, but this is the moral hazard in terms of the structuring of the system, covering for deficit, but this is shifting the problem because we are not solving issues in this way. In this context, what was the point of the essence of the banking crisis? To follow up on what the previous speaker said, it's important to take into account that the reason why Greece was saved the reason is not that the Germans like the Greeks, but the interests related to the banking sector and that everything is interrelated. That's why it was very logical for Germany and France not to allow Greece to go out of the Eurozone with all the consequences. And what are the consequences? In May 2010, because this was the heat of the peak of the debt crisis on the old continent, actually we have $206 billion exposition in Greece, and this is from the perspective of the banking sector in Europe, the whole banking sector. If we focus on the communication and the relations between Germany and France, in terms vis-à-vis Portuguese, Greece, Greek debt, we can see really colossal figures of $48 billion the French banks invested. This is what they invested in the Spanish public debt, and 33 billion was invested by Germany. Similar figures for Greece and less for Portugal. But you can see that this chain effect, this was one of the highest risks. That's why the banking sector had great difficulties. And through the prism of more theoretical issues about the currency system, the fact that it was government-controlled and banking with partial reserves, well, this actually compromised the trust as a main factor for functioning in the banking system. And we saw that a default in Greece could create really turmoils in other countries like Spain, and Spain actually was the key from the French perspective because the most indebted financial system in the Eurozone, the peak of the crisis was not the Greek or Spanish, but actually it was the German, the coefficient, the indebtedness coefficient was 33. That means 3% their own capital. So at this backdrop, there's a high risk for the system, for the currency system. Of course, Germany is not the only country with such a high indebtedness coefficient. But another issue in the Eurozone is related to the maturity discrepancies, and this is true also in the States. The beginning of the crisis is related to this phenomenon that is funding long-term assets with short-term liabilities. So with this short-term financing in Europe, we can see in March 2010 Ireland, and then Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, Great Britain, and so on. So you can see again that Greece, Portugal, Spain, they're not on the top of the list, and this is because of the moral hazard embedded in the system of the Eurozone. That's why we have those consequences. Maybe after this transition, if we see the problematic areas in the whole construction of the Eurozone, maybe we should, in this context, we should look at the banking union and the common framework. And maybe we'll be able to outline the following aspects and directions. Well, first, of course, we have to strengthen the banking sector, the financial system, to facilitate the functioning of the system and to have more efficient and effective competition, and to have smoother lending processes. And the main ideas concern four aspects. First, control over supervision of the banking system, and this concerns the whole financial sector, this common supervision mechanism, which has been scheduled to be put in place soon, and this will change some of the powers and auditing procedures. So the main banking institutions are within its scope, and of course the second pillar is related to a mechanism, institutional framework for restructuring banks, which will either be restructured, that will be supported to recover, or they will go bankrupt through a bankruptcy procedure. We can see we have some regulation. We have a regulation there which has been finalized, but there were many debates about the fund that has to reach 55 billion euros for 80 years, and it used to be 10 years. The European Central Bank made a statement that this amount is insignificant from the point of view of the scale of the banking system. I don't mean that the fund should be larger. And also the European Central Bank will definitely face challenges in terms of its bigger functions and the volume of work, the workload that it has to deal with, because the different national banking systems have they're very different, and about 800 new employees will be needed. But these are technical. This is the technical side, and the last pillar is related to the common scheme for deposit guarantee. And we have very serious problems because, yes, it's a very broad topic. Banking is a very broad topic. West European banks, they don't have much equity, their own capital. But from this perspective, to guarantee deposits is a complex process, and in the previous, when we talked about the public spending, you heard that it's a complex thing, and knowledge is a dynamic thing, and it's very difficult to distribute resources on a central level, to distribute it adequately. And Mr. Angelov mentioned that competition should be targeted at the companies, not states. So it's difficult to resolve this, although it's not insurmountable. But I have to underline that to guarantee deposits, this is one of the main factors, and it brings in a moral hazard, because in view of the commercial companies protected by the state, and we have to be aware of the fact that these are our taxes, the taxes of European citizens. Some from the perspective of the future vision and the adequate reforms, the real reforms that can be of interest and effective and efficient. I personally believe that the European Banking Union, the way it is, is making steps in the right direction, like enhancing capital adequacy. You know, it's very difficult to calculate this. It's very subjectively, and I underline subjectively, calculated, because the equity is not taken into account vis-à-vis the assets, like securities. They are taken out also from the capital adequacy. There's different levels of capital adequacy, but you can see with Basel III and the new regulations that aim to counter this idea it's too big to go bankrupt. So from the perspective of having more capital adequacy, we need to keep an eye on the liquidity coefficients. But there are serious issues, and maybe in June, as soon as June, at the meeting of the European Central Bank, serious action will be taken. Probably will have negative interest rates of on the overnight deposits. Maybe we'll have zero interest rates, main interest rate, and other things are being in preparation, which means that the hot potatoes in the banking system in Europe are very serious thing, and cardinal action should be taken, because with very simple incentives, it's not possible to improve competition and innovations. We're talking about structural reforms that are really urgent in the labor market, and also this idea about the single market. It's a great idea, it's effective, efficient, but there's a lot to do in this direction, because in Europe, still the European Union can still develop. So we have to, I think, currency supply and the banks. I mean that for me, currency supply should be stable, and don't use short-term measures like short-term injections. So I will finish off with ideas about what the possible scenarios for the Eurozone, whether Bulgaria should be part of the Eurozone. Well, this will I can say I'm running out of time, so probably would better leave this for the discussion, but maybe this is an outrageous idea at the first glance, but it's very much debated about guaranteeing deposits. So if there's no guarantee for deposits, banking institutions will increase in a market way, their capital adequacy over 4.5%. As it is under Basel III, and even over 8%, as this is the benchmark for the stress test. In the stress test, So if we are after more efficiency, we need to focus on the market, and the market, this is entrepreneurship. This should be at the forefront, not the central bankers. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. I believe it's the right time now to have a Q&A session. We have 2 microphones, so if you raise your hand, you'll get the mic. And you can ask questions about any of those 4 topics we've been discussing. Good morning. My name is Adelina Rini from EU Insight. My question is to Mr. Lesensky about especially the fact that you included Croatia in the index. Can you explain about the methodology for including Croatia, because it's became EU member states in the middle of the year? And second, how do you connect the quality of education with the media environment? How did you come up with this interdependency? Croatia joined the European Union in the middle of the year, but we decided to, after all, to include it in the analysis because it's now a full member of the European Union. And as we know, some of the effects of the membership can be achieved even before the formal signing of the accession treaty. So we decided to have 10 plus 1, the 10 post-communist countries from Central Southeastern Europe, plus Croatia. So we decided to have this package. So what we can say about Croatia is that while it was a candidate country, it really stood out. It developed very well, but now it's part of the ranking. We can see that it's a good, decent new member state. And what we can also say about Croatia, it hasn't developed much throughout the years. So it started off from a very good, it had a good start, but it didn't develop much. Slovenia, also they had a very high start. I think it were 14th in this ranking, but then it regressed. Not only because of economic, also problems, political problems. So the groups that we formed, they are mainly based on the old member states and the new member states. And now the second question. We actually acted by intuition. We followed our intuition, and this is what we found, this correlation, this interdependency. We can see that there's a strong connection between the two. And you saw it on the chart. You noticed that the countries where there's media freedom, they have high quality of education, but the analysis gives us reason to, doesn't give us a reason to explain. Actually, we cannot explain what is the cause, what is the effect. Good morning. My name is Borislav Sandu from the Greens. I have a question to Mr. Yasin Georgiev and also to Mr. Marin Lesensky. I didn't hear anything about the green economy and the green economy sectors are among the few that were not affected by the crisis, and they're developing very well now. They are creating a lot of new jobs. And my question to Mr. Lesensky is since the potential of the new member states is higher in terms of conservation of the environment, renewables, bio-agriculture, don't you think this is the actually area that will provide more growth for Europe? Thank you for your question. Green energy is a good thing, but it's an expensive thing. And when we talk about countries that are at the bottom of the list in terms of welfare and purchasing power, the question is whether we can afford green energy. Because when Germany decided to do this, we can now think that they could afford to do it. So economies that this is such a stage of development, like our economy, that we are very resource-intensive economies. So to switch to green energy, I think the cost is too high for us. It's unaffordable. So green energy creates jobs in economies that's really at the threshold of the technological barrier. And if you have, it's good to have a green economy for achieving the average economic levels, but it cannot be the driver, the only driver. We need other drivers for economic growth. Green economy can be one of the drivers, but not the only one, because we cannot pay for this. When we were developing the index, we wanted to have a certain number of indicators, which is sufficient number, but still a limited number. We have a very important indicator, the economy category. It is related to the previous question. This is energy intensiveness, intensity, and energy efficiency. Unfortunately, this is one of the main issues, and it's the result is negative. That is, the more energy intensive a country is, the more this country is punished in our index. Bulgaria in previous years was at the bottom of the list, 0 points. That is very high energy intensity. And it's as far as I remember, the index was for Denmark was about 100. Bulgaria was close to 0. So yes, it's included in our analysis. Back in 29, we surveyed the positions, the stance of many member states on a number of issues, and we noticed that the rule of Republicans, deal baby deal, this is the more the better, and the new member states were very much enthusiastic about it, to develop the energy sector rather than focusing on energy efficiency, and this creates a controversy between new member states and old member states. I just want to add something. This was a very good question. We have to know the exact expenditure for the different energy sources. For example, nuclear energy is much cheaper than some of the green energies, but is this correct when we have in mind the capital investment or the spending on pollution? So we have to continue discussing this, not only from an economic point of view, but also from the environmental point of view. Thank you for your question. Colin Manolo from the Institute for Free Capitalism. Is the European Union aware that the crisis, we're maybe now going out of the crisis, but we have not overcome it yet. It was a strategic collapse of the social market economy that's been dominating in the European Union in the past 2 or 3 decades. So this is an over-centralized economy, a redistributing economy that makes it less competitive, and it's based on very costly social acquisitions that require much higher taxes. So the question is whether we are thinking in the right direction about the solutions, and the solutions I think involve the restoration of civil and economic freedoms, and also dealing with the environmental barriers to the economy. Thank you. This was a comment and a question. Thank you for your comment. So if someone wants to answer this question. Yes, I agree with what you said. We should remember that the trade balance plus 50 is plus 50 billion. So we can't say that European Union is not competitive at all. Another philosophical issue is how do we want to live? This is there's a lot of social acquisitions, but the quality of life, despite everything, is not compared to that in the United States. 50 million people without any health insurance until last year. Great inequality, poverty. So their model is not a good example either. But the question is that Europe should find a balance, not go to extremes, and not give up all the social things. But I think we're more going to the other direction. This is one of the challenges for the Union, like uniting uniting people, but we don't know whether they'll be able to do it. The US, they are also a model of the free market. So this is the identical situation was in Western Europe. But I remember something important, and this is the influence of the state on the economic processes, from the perspective that we should not be focusing mainly on the deficit in the public policy, but the amount. We can see that in the US, you have a great tax burden, much more than in Bulgaria, for example. So the socialist model is fully adequate there. From the perspective that in Bulgaria, the tax burden and the influence of the states, the politicians on the economic process is relatively low. but that doesn't mean that it's slow.
Благодаря. Казвам се Кремена Жекова.
My name is Kremena Zhekova. I have a question for Mr. Yasin Georgiev, and it has to do with Bulgaria. We're talking about social costs. Would it be possible to compare the corruptive expenditures, warped projects, and social costs? Can you make a comparison like that? Thank you, Mrs. Zhekova. This is a very interesting question. There's always a limitation in measuring corruption because it's measured on the basis of perception. And therefore, it's very difficult to create a corruption model and to seek the correlations between corruption and the social costs that the state has to shoulder. And just a while ago, we already mentioned that we can distribute less in Bulgaria, that is, the state can distribute relatively less, but we have costs associated with poor efficiency, with leakages of funding, and this is related to the issue of what kind of a Bulgaria we want, where we have more inclusive growth and more social aspects, but we also have to consider whether we'll be happy to accept more financial drain. Hello, my name is Emilia Georgieva. I teach at the National Economy University, and I teach European economy, and I instinctively actually graded you while you spoke. So I'd like to congratulate you on organizing this conference. I was happy to hear all the positions of the panelists. I would like, however, to ask two questions. First, I'd like to ask Mr. Lesinski something. First, I congratulate you on your presentation, but could you give us more data as to when Bulgaria will catch up with the average in the EU? I'm sure you have the data, maybe you just didn't show us that data. And I enjoyed the debate, it's very interesting, but some of the participants became very professional in their presentations, particularly the last speaker, and I think that the majority of people in this room are not sufficiently proficient to understand the messages. So, given the messages we heard today, how will they reach the ordinary layman in the street? Because otherwise, we would be traveling in a luxury liner, and the quality of the people, of the passengers, would be very poor. Well, that was a very good question. If I knew the answer, that would be $1 million question, but this average European data don't exist, but these are just guidelines which allow us to determine at what speed we're moving. So at some point we will get there. We will feel that we've actually got there to some extent. No microphone is used, so we can't hear her. Well, I think I would let the better professionals respond to that, but I can say that some of the countries are very ambitious. For instance, Poland has said that by 2015, they would like to reach 77% of the European standards. I don't know what the situation is with Bulgaria. If I could, I would like to say something. There is no absolute convergence. So the question is, when are we going to catch up? The true question is, when will our institutions converge with the European institutions, and when our innovations will be as good as the average innovations in Europe? Unless we respond to those two questions, we can never respond to the question you've posed. I'm asking, did you fail me? Did I get a fail mark? Well, true, that is the major issue that I perceive, and that is how can such discourses can get to the ordinary people. In political talk, unfortunately, there are other arguments which are becoming very popular, and I sincerely hope that particularly those who use such arguments will not garner a lot of voter support, but I may be surprised. Now, as far as knowledge goes, if we focus on reading ability and education, I would not say that more reading and more education leads to progress. What is important is what we're reading and how we're reading. And being an institute, we try to organize such debates, and we focus on initiatives such as the one today. So this is the way to go. But this is a very slow, gradual process, and I very much hope that as more people join these debates, common sense will prevail, because these particular issues are being given the short shrift in the media, in public debates, and this may sound as a paradox, but it's the truth. We very much hope that each one of us is aware of the responsibility to pass on the message, and I hope that in your teaching at university, students do hear these arguments. And at MoveBG, we're trying to coordinate these efforts, because there are people who care about the future and our common European pathway. I hope that there will be more and more people who will subscribe to that view. Otherwise, the answer to your question is we'll get there in 2020. The question is, how fast are we racing to that point? Are we chasing away foreign investors? And what else are we doing? So the important thing is not to backtrack. That's the only thing which the politicians and the so-called elite must take care of. And as to how well they deal with that task, well, that will depend on who we won't vote for. No microphone. We have a question here. Koyan Simyonov. I teach at Sophia University. I have a question from Mr. Sirkarov. We were saying that Bulgaria should be key to the debate. And since we're talking our so-called elites or real elites, why don't we talk much about preparations for joining the Eurozone? For instance, in years past, there was a strategy of the central bank for Eurozone. And is this because that idea is no longer popular with the population? Or is it because this is becoming a moving target because of the banking union? Or is it because we're not prepared and we're not living up to the Maastricht criteria? So is there a paradox here? We start receiving, for instance, messages from Romania that they will join the Eurozone in 2019, and the Baltics. Yes, thank you for this question. Indeed, to me, that is the most important question that has to be debated within the context of the EP elections. For Bulgaria in particular, this is the key issue. By and large, by signing the EU agreements, we have agreed to join the Eurozone, although there are no specific dates that are invoked. And I remember the Oresharski plan when he was Minister of Finance. Then it was debated how and what structures should be used, what strategy should be employed, because we have an effective currency board and there are specifics associated with that. It is being said that we're almost there, but it's not the same. It's very different. Now, if we take an analysis of the pros and cons of Eurozone membership, we could say that quantitatively the cons exceed the pros. And this is within the context of the difficulties that some of the biggest member states are experiencing. So funding up some of the problems means that Bulgaria would be affected were we a member of the Eurozone. However, given the experience we have and what happened in 96-97 here, which was not so long ago, we need to remember the events of those years. And this is an argument in favor of Eurozone membership, because then Bulgarian politicians and the central bank would have no other options. We saw what happened in 96-97 in Bulgaria. So that's a key lesson, because there are risks, and as of date there's been a lot of talk about the currency board and how the currency board is a barrier to us, and a lot of people are positing this as an argument. If we take Stiglitz and Krugman and the Keynesian vision of the economic development and how the cogwheels of the economy can get moving, but the advantage of actually exiting from these risks that we saw in 96 is there, and the currency board is in fact part of the central bank regulation, and even if the currency board is revoked, it can be modified. And the Bulgarian National Bank, the central bank, has a lot of modalities to respond to a crisis. Crisis in the banking system, and we haven't had a banking crisis since 96, when the 97, when the currency board was introduced. And there are some people who are proposing arguments. I will not name them because I don't want to advertise them, but they're proposing communist strategies of a regulatory economy, nationalization, chasing away all the investors, and this borders on madness. And financial failure. So our struggle to get into the Eurozone is quite adequate to the situation, and we need to move on to the waiting room of the Eurozone. And even though Bulgarian opinions do not carry a lot of weight within the EU, the fact that we have spent many years pegged to a stable currency exchange should mean something. I would just like to expound on this. I have no idea what the political price for Eurozone membership is affordable, because membership in the Eurozone means that we would have to provide guarantees that we can support countries who have problems with their national budgets, and I don't think that is an obligation any Bulgarian politician is willing to take. And we might find ourselves in a situation where we monitor what is happening in the Eurozone and adopt all the decisions there, but we will be passive recipients without the possibility to impact. So are we willing to pay the price to bail out countries who have difficulties because we were conservative and did our homework, so we're not in dire straits? And now, last question, because we are far behind the schedule.
In English, I'm from Holland. I'm writing a live blog for the Dutch audience now. The question is this. I heard a question from the honored lady about Bulgaria reaching up to the top of the Northern Europe, but they face a huge budget cut due to the money flowing into the south. Isn't it more likely that the north of Europe will catch up with the load or the height of the southern Europe instead of Bulgaria growing?
Да преведем. Въпросът на господин Мартен Вонг.
Just interpreting the question that Mr. Vonk asked.
Покачи нивото си с северните държави. Това не значи ли, че северните държави страдат от голям намаление на техния бюджет и как те трябва да реагират на повишаването на качеството на живот в България?
Краткият отговор е не.
The brief response is no. Why? Well, that is because in the past 3 to 4 years there was many imbalances because of the credit crisis in Greece, Spain, Italy, and that range of countries. And this should be considered a one-off event so that the Eurozone can continue to exist. And I agree that our participation should happen once these processes are over. The truth is that the main exporters in Europe, the main contributors, need a unified union in order to be able to export within it, in order to become more competitive because they can export. So there are many correlations and interdependencies, but I do agree that the dramatic events because of this crisis, which has nothing to do with the cohesion, has affected the system. In the long term, however, I don't think that this is high drama or a problem. Well, with this we'll close this